Zara Washington pulled her worn basketball jersey down over her gym shorts one more time as she stood outside the double doors of Lincoln Heights High School's gymnasium. The morning sun streamed through the hallway windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors that seemed to stretch endlessly toward her destination. At 16, Zara had mastered the art of moving through school like a shadow, keeping her head down and her movements deliberate, avoiding the clusters of students who might notice her presence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Her dark skin glistened slightly with nervous perspiration as she adjusted the elastic band holding her natural hair in a tight ponytail. The red jersey hung loose on her lean frame, deliberately chosen 2 sizes too large to hide the defined muscles beneath. Most students at Lincoln Heights saw exactly what Zara intended them to see. A quiet girl from the wrong side of town who kept to herself and never caused trouble. The gymnasium doors loomed before her like the entrance to an arena, which, in many ways, they were. Physical education was the one class Zara couldn't simply blend into the background during. There was nowhere to hide when you were required to participate, to move, to potentially draw attention to abilities you'd spent years learning to suppress. Zara's fingers unconsciously traced the small scar above her left eyebrow, a barely visible reminder of lessons learned in places far removed from the suburban comfort of Lincoln Heights. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, spoken in the Mandarin Chinese that had filled their small apartment every evening for the past 5 years. Strength is not about showing what you can do. True strength is knowing when not to use what you've learned. The irony wasn't lost on her, that she was one of the few black students at Lincoln Heights who also happened to speak fluent Mandarin, a skill that would surprise her classmates almost as much as her other, more carefully hidden abilities. Her grandmother, Chen Wei, had insisted on teaching her the language alongside other disciplines during the years they'd lived together in San Francisco's Chinatown, before circumstances had forced Zara to move to the suburbs with her aunt. She pushed through the gymnasium doors and was immediately hit with the familiar scent of rubber flooring, old basketballs, and industrial disinfectant. The vast space echoed with the sounds of early arriving students claiming territories on the bleachers, their conversations bouncing off the high ceiling like scattered ping-pong balls. Coach Martinez was setting up equipment near the far wall, his whistle already hanging around his neck like a badge of authority. He was a fair man, Zara had learned over the past semester, but he was also overwhelmed by the dynamics of teenage social hierarchies that played out in his gymnasium daily. He had 30 students to manage during each class period, and maintaining order often took precedence over protecting the vulnerable. Zara made her way to the girls' locker room, nodding silently to a few classmates who acknowledged her with equally quiet greetings. Inside the rows of metal lockers, she could hear the familiar sounds of the popular crowd claiming their territory. Laughter echoed off the tiled walls, punctuated by the sharp sounds of locker doors slamming and the rustle of designer athletic wear being arranged just so. She opened her assigned locker, number 847, and began the careful ritual of changing clothes. The simple act required strategic planning in this environment. She had learned to arrive early enough to change before the main crowd appeared, but not so early as to draw attention to her eagerness to avoid confrontation. As she pulled on her regulation gym shoes, Zara caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror attached to the inside of her locker door. Her reflection showed a girl who looked younger than her 16 years, with large dark eyes that held depths her classmates couldn't begin to imagine. Those eyes had seen things, learned things, that belonged to a different world entirely. The scar above her eyebrow was just one of several small marks that told stories she'd never shared with anyone at Lincoln Heights. There was a thin line on her left palm from learning to handle training weapons, a barely visible mark on her shoulder from a particularly intense sparring session, and calluses on her knuckles that she kept carefully hidden beneath hand cream and deliberate positioning. Her phone buzzed with a text from her Aunt Carmen. "Have a good day, baby girl. Remember what Grandma Chen always said about inner strength." The message brought a small smile to Zara's face. Aunt Carmen was trying her best to understand the complex legacy that Zara's grandmother had left behind, even if she didn't fully grasp the extent of what those years in Chinatown had actually entailed. Zara's grandmother had been an unusual woman with an unusual past. Chen Wei had immigrated to America as a young woman, but not before spending her adolescence in a very different kind of school, in rural China. She'd rarely spoken about those years directly, but the skills she'd passed on to Zara told their own story. What most people would call martial arts, Grandma Chen had simply called life preparation. "In China, we learn to be ready for anything," she would say during their evening practice sessions in the tiny courtyard behind their Chinatown apartment building. "Not because we wanted to fight, but because we needed to survive. You must learn too, Xiaobao." The pet name, meaning little treasure, always made Zara feel special, chosen for something important. Those evening sessions had started when Zara was 11 and had continued until her grandmother's death, just before her 15th birthday. What began as simple exercises for flexibility and balance had evolved into something far more comprehensive. Grandma Chen had taught her traditional Chinese martial arts, but with a practical edge that suggested real-world application rather than ceremonial performance. "American schools will not understand what you can do," her grandmother had warned during one of their last conversations. "They will see a young black girl and make assumptions. Let them. Assumptions are weaknesses in others that become strengths for you." The wisdom of those words had become clear during Zara's first weeks at Lincoln Heights. The student body was predominantly white and upper-middle class, with most families living in the newer subdivisions that had sprouted around the original town center. Zara's aunt's modest apartment was technically within the school district boundaries, but it might as well have been on another planet for all the common ground she shared with her classmates. She closed her locker and made her way back into the gymnasium, where more students were now gathering for first-period PE. The social dynamics were as predictable as they were painful to watch. The athletes clustered near the equipment storage, the academic overachievers found seats on the bleachers where they could continue studying until class officially began, and the social elite staked out their territory in the center of the space. Coach Martinez blew his whistle once, a signal for students to begin gathering for attendance. Zara positioned herself in the back row of the informal formation that was taking shape, a spot that allowed her to observe without being observed, to participate without standing out. "All right, people," Coach Martinez called out, his voice carrying easily through the large space. "Today we're starting our basketball unit. I'll be dividing you into teams for some scrimmage games to assess your current skill levels." Zara felt her stomach tighten. Team selection was always a minefield for students like her. Too skilled, and you drew unwanted attention. Not skilled enough, and you became a target for frustration and blame. She had learned to aim for the middle ground, contributing just enough to avoid criticism while holding back enough to remain unremarkable. But basketball was different. Basketball required instincts that were harder to suppress, reactions that came from muscle memory developed over years of training that had nothing to do with sports and everything to do with survival. The hand-eye coordination, the spatial awareness, the ability to read an opponent's intentions in their body language, these were skills that crossed over between disciplines in ways that could be dangerous to reveal. As Coach Martinez began calling names for teams, Zara found herself studying the other students with the analytical eye her grandmother had trained her to use. She could assess each person's likely athletic ability, their confidence level, their potential for aggression, all from subtle cues in their posture and movement. There was Kevin Chen, no relation to her grandmother despite the shared surname, who carried himself with the loose confidence of someone who'd grown up playing competitive sports. His movements were economical and purposeful, suggesting genuine skill rather than just bravado. Near the front stood Ashley Thompson, whose designer athletic wear and perfectly coordinated accessories suggested someone more concerned with appearance than performance, but whose subtle muscle definition indicated she wasn't entirely soft. And then there was the group that made Zara's trained instincts spark with warning signals. 3 girls who moved together like a pack, their positioning and body language speaking of established dominance hierarchies and predatory awareness. Even without knowing their names or histories, Zara could identify them as potential threats through lessons learned in environments where reading people incorrectly could have serious consequences. The lead girl was tall and blonde, with the kind of casual confidence that came from never having her authority seriously challenged. Her 2 companions flanked her in positions that suggested both protection and submission, a dynamic that spoke of complex social structures and carefully maintained power balances. Zara forced herself to look away, to blend back into the unremarkable background where she was safest. But she had already seen enough to know that her careful strategy of invisibility might not be enough in an environment as exposed and competitive as the basketball court. Coach Martinez finished calling names, and Zara found herself assigned to Team 3, a mixed group that included several students she recognized but had never spoken with. The composition was neither the best nor worst possible outcome, which was exactly what she had been hoping for. As the teams began to separate and claim their designated areas of the court for warm-up exercises, Zara caught a glimpse of her reflection in the gymnasium's mirrored wall. For just a moment, she saw not the quiet, unremarkable student she worked so hard to appear as, but the girl her grandmother had trained. The girl who could move like water and strike like lightning, who understood balance and leverage and the 100 ways to turn an opponent's strength against them. Then she blinked, and the reflection returned to normal. Just Zara Washington, 16 years old, trying to make it through another day at Lincoln Heights High School without drawing the wrong kind of attention. But as she began the simple warm-up exercises Coach Martinez was demonstrating, she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed invisibility was about to be tested in ways she wasn't prepared for. The gymnasium suddenly felt smaller, more confined, like the training spaces of her childhood, where every movement had consequences and every lesson carried the weight of necessity. And somewhere in the back of her mind, her grandmother's voice whispered a warning in Mandarin that roughly translated to, "When the storm comes, little treasure, remember that bamboo bends, but does not break." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The warm-up exercises had barely begun when Zara became acutely aware of the social undercurrents flowing through the gymnasium like invisible electric currents. Coach Martinez was demonstrating proper stretching techniques at the front of the class, but most students were only half listening, their attention divided between the required movements and the complex social navigation that defined every interaction at Lincoln Heights. "Oh great, look who's on our team," came a voice that cut through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. The tone was deliberately loud enough to carry, designed to draw attention while maintaining plausible deniability about its intended target. Zara didn't need to look up from her hamstring stretch to know the voice belonged to Brittany Caldwell. Even after only 3 months at Lincoln Heights, certain voices became impossible to ignore once you'd been marked by them. Brittany was the kind of girl who wielded her social status like a weapon, sharp and precise, always finding the exact spot where words could inflict maximum damage. At 17, Brittany had perfected an image that seemed effortlessly superior to everyone around her. Her blonde hair was always styled with a kind of casual perfection that actually required significant time and money to achieve. Her athletic wear bore designer labels that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month, but she wore them with the casual indifference of someone who had never had to consider the price of anything. "I mean, seriously," Brittany continued, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to having an audience hang on her every word. "Why do they keep putting the charity cases on actual teams? Shouldn't there be a separate division for people who obviously can't afford private coaching?" Her 2 constant companions, Megan Porter and Rachel Stevens, flanked her in positions that had clearly been refined through years of practice. Megan was shorter and darker, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was always looking for approval from her more confident friend. Rachel was tall and athletic, with red hair pulled back in a severe ponytail and the build of someone who had been playing competitive sports since childhood. The dynamic between the 3 girls was as carefully orchestrated as any military formation. Brittany was clearly the commander, making the decisions and setting the tone for every interaction. Megan served as the amplifier, laughing at precisely the right moments and providing encouraging sounds that validated Brittany's commentary. Rachel was the enforcer, her athletic build and competitive nature making her the perfect backup when psychological warfare needed physical support. Zara continued her stretching routine, keeping her movements steady and unremarkable, while her trained awareness cataloged every detail of the interaction unfolding around her. Years of instruction from her grandmother had taught her to observe without appearing to watch, to gather information while maintaining the facade of disinterest. "Did you see her shoes?" Megan chimed in with the kind of theatrical whisper that was designed to be overheard. "I think those are from the discount rack at that cheap store in the strip mall. My mom won't even shop there because she says the quality is so poor." Rachel's contribution was more direct, her voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who had learned that athletic success provided social immunity for almost any behavior. "Look at how she's stretching. I bet she's never been in a real gym in her life. This is probably the most exercise she gets all week. The comments were calculated with surgical precision, each one designed to establish dominance while creating a public spectacle that would reinforce social hierarchies. Other students were beginning to notice the interaction, their own conversations slowing as they sensed the familiar dynamic beginning to play out. Coach Martinez remained focused on his demonstration at the front of the class, either unaware of the developing situation or choosing to ignore it in favor of maintaining his lesson plan. This was the eternal challenge of authority figures in school environments, the impossibility of monitoring every microaggression while still accomplishing educational objectives. Zara had seen this pattern before, in different schools and different contexts, but the fundamental dynamics never changed. There were always predators who identified vulnerability and exploited it for their own psychological needs. There were always followers who enabled the behavior in exchange for protection from becoming targets themselves. And there were always bystanders who witnessed the cruelty but chose safety over intervention. You know what I heard? Brittany's voice had taken on the conspiratorial tone that preceded her most devastating attacks. I heard she's here on some kind of charity scholarship thing. Like her family is so poor that the school district has to pay for her to attend here instead of going to the public school where she belongs. The information was delivered with the kind of casual precision that suggested research had been conducted. Brittany wasn't the type to make accusations without having some basis in fact, which made her attacks particularly effective. She had clearly taken the time to investigate Zara's background, gathering ammunition for precisely this kind of public humiliation. Megan gasped with theatrical shock, as if this revelation was both surprising and deeply concerning. That's so sad! I mean, it's nice that they try to help people like that, but doesn't it seem unfair to the students whose families actually live in this district and pay taxes here? Rachel's response was more pragmatic, reflecting her athletes' focus on competition and performance. It's going to be annoying when we have to carry dead weight during the games. Coach Martinez should really consider skill level when he makes these team assignments. The conversation was unfolding exactly as Brittany had intended, drawing more attention from surrounding students while creating a narrative that positioned Zara as both an outsider and a burden. It was a masterclass in social manipulation, designed to isolate the target while rallying group sentiment against her. Zara felt the familiar burning sensation that started in her chest whenever she was forced to endure this kind of systematic humiliation. Her grandmother's training had included extensive instruction on controlling emotional responses, recognizing that anger could compromise judgment and lead to mistakes. But the techniques that worked in the controlled environment of their practice sessions felt inadequate in the face of such calculated cruelty. Other students were beginning to position themselves strategically around the developing conflict. Some moved closer, drawn by the entertainment value of watching someone else become the target of ridicule. Others created distance, protecting themselves from potential collateral damage if the situation escalated. Kevin Chen, the skilled basketball player she had noticed earlier, seemed uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation but made no move to intervene. Several other students showed similar signs of discomfort, their body language suggesting they recognized the unfairness of the situation while lacking the courage or social standing to address it directly. I wonder if she even knows how to play basketball, Brittany continued, her voice growing more confident as she sensed the audience she had attracted. I mean, growing up in whatever neighborhood she's from, they probably don't have access to proper courts or equipment. This could be really embarrassing for all of us. The attack was shifting from general social commentary to specific predictions about athletic performance, raising the stakes for the upcoming team activities. Brittany was creating a scenario where any mistake or moment of inexperience would be magnified and attributed to Zara's supposed background deficiencies. Megan picked up the thread with enthusiasm, her voice carrying the kind of false concern that made her words particularly cutting. Maybe we should ask Coach Martinez if we can switch teams. I mean, it's not fair to the other students if we're going to be held back by someone who clearly doesn't have the same opportunities we've had. Rachel's contribution was more ominous, her competitive nature translating into a barely veiled threat. Or maybe she'll surprise us and actually know what she's doing. Though I have to say, if someone's going to talk big, they better be able to back it up on the court. The implication was clear. Any display of actual skill would be met with suspicion and potentially escalated confrontation. Brittany's group had created a lose-lose scenario, where failure would confirm their narrative about Zara's inadequacy, while success would be treated as some form of deception or threat to their established order. Coach Martinez finally completed his demonstration and began moving toward the teams to begin the actual basketball activities. His approach would normally signal the end of social conversations and the beginning of focused athletic instruction, but Brittany seemed determined to establish her dominance before official activities commenced. "Just so we're all clear," Brittany said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone issuing a formal declaration. "Some of us have been playing basketball since we were little kids. Some of us have had professional coaching and summer camps, and all the advantages that come with proper preparation. And some of us," her gaze finally moved directly toward Zara, "are probably just hoping to avoid embarrassing themselves too badly." The direct confrontation represented an escalation from indirect commentary to open challenge. Brittany was no longer content to attack through innuendo and suggestion. She was demanding a response that would either establish Zara's submission or provide justification for further aggression. Zara felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the gymnasium focused on her, waiting to see how she would respond to this public challenge. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her about the importance of choosing battles wisely and never revealing capabilities until absolutely necessary. The moment stretched out like a held breath, filled with the potential energy of a dozen different possible responses. Around them, the normal sounds of the gymnasium seemed muted, as if the entire space was waiting to see which direction this confrontation would develop. Coach Martinez was still approaching their section of the court, close enough now that any response would have to account for his presence. The social dynamics of the situation were about to collide with the official structure of the class, creating a complex environment where multiple audiences would witness whatever happened next. Brittany's smile held all the confidence of someone who had never experienced real consequences for her actions, someone who had learned that social status provided immunity from accountability. Her positioning and that of her friends suggested they were prepared for any possible response, whether it was submission, verbal retaliation, or an attempt to seek adult intervention. But what none of them could have anticipated was that their target had been trained by someone who understood conflict at levels they couldn't imagine, someone who had learned to recognize predatory behavior and respond with strategies developed over generations of survival. The basketball unit was about to begin, and with it, a confrontation that would reveal just how dangerous it could be to mistake quiet dignity for weakness. The basketball drills began with deceptive simplicity. Coach Martinez had divided the class into their assigned teams and started with basic passing exercises, the kind of fundamental skills that seemed harmless enough to lull everyone into a false sense of routine normalcy. But Zara could feel the undercurrent of tension that had been established during warm-ups continuing to build beneath the surface of organized activity. "All right, Team 3, you're up first," Coach Martinez called out, pointing toward Zara's group. "A simple chest passes in a circle. Focus on form, not speed." The exercise should have been straightforward. 6 students arranged in a circle, passing a basketball clockwise while Coach Martinez observed their technique and offered corrections. But the moment the ball was introduced, the social dynamics that had been simmering during warm-ups exploded into active warfare. Brittany had maneuvered herself to a position directly across from Zara in the circle, her placement strategic rather than coincidental. When the ball reached her, she held it for a moment longer than necessary, her eyes locked on Zara's face with the kind of predatory focus that suggested she was looking for any sign of weakness or uncertainty. "Are you ready for this?" Brittany asked, her voice carrying just enough mock concern to maintain plausible deniability while making her real intentions clear. "I know this might be more advanced than what you're used to." The pass that followed was deliberately hard and slightly off-target, designed to test Zara's reflexes while creating an opportunity for criticism, regardless of the outcome. If Zara failed to catch it cleanly, she would be labeled clumsy or unprepared. If she handled it successfully, Brittany would escalate to more challenging tests until she found a breaking point. Zara caught the ball smoothly, her movements economized and controlled in ways that reflected training far more sophisticated than basic physical education. But she immediately recognized the trap that was being constructed around her. Any display of genuine skill would draw attention and questions, while any apparent struggle would provide ammunition for further attacks. She passed the ball to the next student with deliberate mediocrity, making sure her technique was adequate but unremarkable. It was a careful balance that required constant calculation, appearing competent enough to avoid criticism while remaining invisible enough to avoid scrutiny. But Brittany wasn't satisfied with subtle testing. As the drill continued, her passes became increasingly aggressive, each one pushing the boundaries of what could be explained as legitimate practice. She was using the structure of the exercise to wage psychological warfare, turning what should have been cooperative learning into a series of individual challenges. "Wow, you actually caught that one," Megan observed with theatrical surprise after Zara successfully handled a particularly difficult pass. "I was sure it was going to hit you in the face." Rachel's commentary was more direct, her competitive nature translating into open assessment of Zara's performance. "Her form is weird, though. Like she's trying too hard to look like she knows what she's doing." The comments were designed to create doubt and self-consciousness, to make Zara question her own movements and second-guess her instincts. It was a form of psychological pressure that could be devastating to someone who lacked confidence or experience dealing with systematic harassment. Coach Martinez, focused on observing multiple teams simultaneously, missed the subtle escalation taking place within Team 3's circle. His attention was divided between providing technical instruction and maintaining general order among 30 students, leaving room for the kind of targeted aggression that operated just below the threshold of obvious rule violations. The situation intensified when the drill progressed to more complex passing patterns that required closer cooperation between team members. Brittany began incorporating deliberate mistakes that she could blame on her teammates, particularly Zara, while maintaining the appearance of trying her best to make the exercises work. "Sorry, I thought you were ready for that pass," Brittany said after deliberately throwing the ball to a spot where Zara would have to make an awkward stretch to reach it. "Maybe if you were paying attention instead of looking around like you're lost." The criticism was accompanied by sympathetic looks toward the other team members, as if Brittany was the reasonable one trying to work with a difficult partner. It was manipulation at its most sophisticated, designed to isolate Zara by turning the team dynamic against her. Kevin Chen, who had been quietly observing the escalating tension, finally spoke up with the kind of diplomatic intervention that suggested he recognized what was happening, but lacked the social standing to directly challenge Brittany's behavior. "Maybe we should focus on our own technique instead of critiquing each other," he suggested, his voice carefully neutral. Coach Martinez said form was more important than perfection. Brittany's response was swift and cutting, designed to establish that any interference with her dominance would be met with immediate consequences. "I don't remember asking for your opinion, Kevin. Some of us are actually trying to help our team succeed instead of making excuses for poor performance." The rebuke was delivered with enough force to make Kevin step back from further intervention, reinforcing the social hierarchy that placed Brittany's authority above any challenges from fellow students. It was a demonstration of power that served multiple purposes, punishing Kevin for his interference while sending a clear message to anyone else considering similar intervention. As the passing drills concluded and Coach Martinez prepared to introduce shooting practice, the tension within Team 3 had reached a point where even casual observers were beginning to notice the unusual dynamics at play. Several students from other teams were casting glances toward their group, sensing that something more significant than normal competitive friction was developing. The shooting drill introduced a new level of individual exposure that played perfectly into Brittany's escalating campaign of harassment. Each team member would take turns attempting shots from various positions around the basket while their teammates rebounded and provided encouragement. It was exactly the kind of individual performance situation that allowed for detailed critique of every movement and result. "Ladies first," Brittany announced when their team reached the basketball hoop, her tone carrying the kind of false gallantry that made the offer feel more like a challenge than courtesy. "Zara, why don't you show us what you've got?" The invitation was delivered with the confidence of someone who had already calculated the most likely outcomes and prepared responses for each possibility. If Zara missed her shots, Brittany would have concrete evidence to support her narrative about inadequate preparation and skill. If Zara made her shots, Brittany would escalate to more challenging tests until she found a point of failure. Zara took the basketball and positioned herself at the free throw line, acutely aware that every eye in the vicinity was now focused on her performance. The weight of the ball felt familiar in her hands, triggering muscle memory from countless hours of training that had nothing to do with basketball, but everything to do with hand-eye coordination, spatial awareness, and precise control of movement. Her grandmother's training had included extensive work with various objects, stones, sticks, weighted balls, anything that could develop the kind of precise motor control that transferred across different physical activities. Basketball shooting was simply another application of principles she had mastered years ago, but revealing that level of competence would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. She took her shot with deliberate imperfection, making sure the ball went in but with enough struggle in her form to suggest luck rather than skill. The result was exactly what she had intended, successful enough to avoid criticism, ordinary enough to avoid attention. But Brittany had been watching with the focused intensity of someone looking for any excuse to escalate the confrontation. "Interesting technique," she commented, her voice carrying the kind of analytical tone that suggested she had noticed something others might have missed. "You shoot like someone who's been practicing in secret. Where exactly did you learn to handle a basketball like that?" The question was delivered with surgical precision, designed to create suspicion about Zara's background, while demanding an explanation that could be used as ammunition for further attacks. It was exactly the kind of probing that Zara had been trained to recognize and deflect. But in this public setting with multiple audiences, her options for response were severely limited. "I've played a little pickup basketball," Zara replied, keeping her answer as vague and unremarkable as possible. "Nothing serious." But Brittany wasn't satisfied with simple deflection. Her predatory instincts had been triggered by the disconnect between Zara's apparent skill level and her carefully constructed image of inexperience. "Pick up basketball where?" "Because there aren't any decent courts in your neighborhood that I know of." The question revealed that Brittany had indeed conducted research into Zara's background, investigating her living situation and making assumptions about the resources available to her based on economic status. It was the kind of calculated cruelty that went beyond casual bullying into systematic harassment. Megan and Rachel immediately picked up on their leader's escalating aggression, positioning themselves to provide support for whatever direction the confrontation was about to take. Their body language suggested they were prepared for the situation to move beyond verbal harassment if necessary. "Maybe she's been getting private coaching," Rachel suggested with mock speculation. "I mean, someone had to teach her that weird form. It's definitely not natural." "Private coaching costs money, though," Megan added with false confusion. "I thought her family couldn't afford that kind of thing." The comments were creating a narrative framework that would make any demonstration of skill seem suspicious or deceptive, while simultaneously reinforcing the economic class distinctions that Brittany was using as weapons. It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, designed to make the target feel isolated and defensive regardless of how they responded. Coach Martinez was approaching their group again, having finished observing the other team's shooting practice. His presence would normally provide some protection from escalating harassment, but Brittany had proven adept at timing her attacks to operate just below the threshold of adult intervention. "How's Team 3 doing over here?" Coach Martinez asked, his tone carrying the kind of professional enthusiasm that suggested he was focused on athletic instruction rather than social dynamics. "Great, Coach," Brittany replied immediately, her voice switching to the respectful tone she reserved for authority figures. "We're just helping Zara work on her shooting technique. She's got some interesting habits that we thought you might want to see." The response was masterfully crafted to appear helpful, while actually drawing official attention to Zara's performance in a way that would increase pressure and scrutiny. It was exactly the kind of manipulation that made Brittany so effective at systematic harassment. She understood how to use authority figures as unwitting participants in her campaigns of dominance. Coach Martinez turned his attention to Zara with the kind of professional assessment that could either provide protection or create additional pressure, depending on what he observed. "Let's see a few more shots, Zara. I'd like to evaluate your form and see if there are any adjustments we should work on." The instruction transformed what had been a team exercise into an individual performance with official observation, exactly the kind of elevated stakes that Brittany had been maneuvering toward. Zara now faced a situation where her response would be witnessed and evaluated by both her tormentors and an authority figure who would expect some demonstration of effort and skill. The gymnasium seemed to grow quieter as other students sensed that something significant was developing around Team 3's shooting practice. The casual background noise of other activities continued, but there was a new quality of attention focused on their corner of the court. Zara bounced the ball twice, feeling the familiar weight and texture while calculating the most strategic response to the situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her control. Every option carried risks, and she was running out of ways to navigate between the competing demands of remaining invisible while satisfying the expectations now focused on her performance. The basketball felt different in Zara's hands now that Coach Martinez was watching with professional interest, and half the gymnasium had turned their attention toward Team 3's corner of the court. The weight was the same, the texture familiar, but the context had transformed a simple shooting drill into something that felt like a public trial with her dignity hanging in the balance. "Take your time," Coach Martinez said, his voice carrying the kind of encouraging tone that teachers used when they sensed a student was struggling with pressure. "Focus on your form and follow through." But Zara could see Brittany's satisfied smile in her peripheral vision, the expression of someone who had successfully maneuvered a situation to her advantage. This was exactly what Brittany had been working toward, a moment where Zara would be forced to perform under scrutiny with no good options for response. The first shot Zara took was calculated mediocrity, deliberately missing the rim by a narrow margin that suggested effort without competence. She had learned over the years that it was safer to appear to struggle than to reveal capabilities that would invite questions and attention. "That's okay," Coach Martinez said, retrieving the ball and passing it back to her. "Try adjusting your elbow position and really concentrate on your follow-through." Brittany's voice cut through the instructional moment with surgical precision. "Coach, I think the problem might be that she's never had proper instruction before. Maybe we should start with some more basic drills?" The suggestion was delivered with the kind of helpful tone that made it sound like genuine concern for a struggling teammate. But Zara recognized it for what it really was, an attempt to publicly establish her as someone who needed remedial assistance, someone who didn't belong at the same level as her classmates. "I'm fine," Zara said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the ambient noise of the gymnasium. But even as she spoke, she could feel something shifting inside her, a familiar sensation that her grandmother had taught her to recognize as the moment when patience reached its natural limits. "Are you, though?" Rachel interjected, her athletic confidence translating into direct challenge. "Because it looks like you're struggling with pretty basic stuff here. Maybe Brittany's right about needing some extra help." The comment was delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that suggested Rachel genuinely believed she was stating obvious facts rather than participating in systematic harassment. Her competitive nature made her particularly dangerous because she seemed to view Zara's apparent struggles as evidence of legitimate inadequacy, rather than recognizing the deliberate campaign being waged against her. Megan's contribution was softer but equally cutting, delivered with the kind of false sympathy that made her words particularly painful. "It's not your fault if you haven't had the same opportunities as everyone else. We all start somewhere, right?" The patronizing tone was designed to be devastating, reducing Zara to the status of someone who needed charity and pity rather than recognition as an equal. It was exactly the kind of psychological warfare that Brittany specialized in, attacks that appeared compassionate on the surface while delivering maximum humiliation to their target. Coach Martinez, focused on technical instruction and unaware of the social dynamics at play, continued his attempts to provide helpful coaching. "Let's try a few more shots, Zara. Sometimes it just takes a little practice to find your rhythm." But as Zara prepared for her next attempt, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. In the doorway of the gymnasium, partially hidden behind the large equipment storage cabinet, stood Mr. Peterson, the assistant principal who handled disciplinary issues. His presence suggested that someone had reported a developing situation that required administrative attention. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Brittany hadn't just been orchestrating a casual harassment session during gym class. She had been building towards something larger, something that would require official intervention and create a permanent record of whatever was about to happen. "Actually," Brittany said, her voice taking on a new quality that suggested the real attack was just beginning, "I think there's something Coach Martinez should know about our teammate here." The statement was delivered with the kind of dramatic timing that immediately captured everyone's attention. Other students who had been focused on their own activities turned toward Team 3's corner, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Coach Martinez paused in his instruction, his expression shifting from encouraging teacher to concerned authority figure. "What's going on, Brittany?" "Well," Brittany began, her voice carrying the kind of reluctant concern that made her seem like someone being forced to reveal unpleasant truths for the greater good. "I've been doing some research about our school's diversity initiatives, and I discovered some really interesting information about how certain students are selected for enrollment here." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, their implications immediately clear to everyone within hearing range. Brittany was about to weaponize Zara's scholarship status and family background in front of an official audience, turning what had been social harassment into a public humiliation that would follow her for the rest of her time at Lincoln Heights. "Brittany," Coach Martinez said, his tone carrying a warning that suggested he recognized the direction this conversation was heading, "this isn't the appropriate time or place for." "I think it is appropriate," Brittany interrupted, her voice getting stronger and more confident as she sensed victory within reach. "Because I think we deserve to know if we're competing on a level playing field here. I think we deserve to know if some people are getting special treatment because of their background, instead of their actual qualifications." The accusation was delivered with the kind of righteous indignation that made it sound like Brittany was fighting for justice rather than engaging in racist harassment. She had wrapped her attack in the language of fairness and merit, making it difficult for authority figures to address without appearing to take sides in a complex social issue. Zara felt something snap inside her chest, a sensation like a carefully maintained dam finally giving way under unbearable pressure. All the years of training from her grandmother, all the lessons about patience and strategic thinking, all the careful self-control that had gotten her through months of systematic abuse, it all crumbled in the face of this public assault on her family's honor and her right to exist in this space. "You want to know about my background?" Zara said, her voice cutting through the gymnasium noise with a clarity and authority that made everyone within range stop what they were doing to listen. "You want to know about qualifications and level playing fields?" The transformation in her voice was so dramatic that Coach Martinez took an involuntary step backward, his expression shifting from concern to something approaching alarm. This was no longer the quiet, struggling student he thought he had been trying to help. This was someone else entirely. "Lale." Brittany's smile faltered slightly as she registered the change in Zara's demeanor, but her confidence in her social position kept her from recognizing the real danger she had just awakened. "I'm just saying that some of us have earned our place here through hard work and legitimate achievement, while others—" "Others what?" Zara interrupted, her voice carrying a new quality that made several students take involuntary steps backward. "Others don't deserve to be here? Others should be grateful for whatever scraps they're given? Others should quietly accept being treated like garbage because of where they come from?" The questions were delivered with increasing intensity, each one building on the last until Zara's voice filled the entire corner of the gymnasium. Students from other teams had stopped their activities entirely, drawn by the unprecedented sound of someone directly challenging Brittany's authority. "That's not what I said," Brittany replied, but for the first time since Zara had known her, there was uncertainty in her voice. The careful social calculations that usually guided her interactions were being disrupted by this unexpected response to her provocation. "No, but it's what you meant," Zara continued, taking a step closer to Brittany that made Megan and Rachel automatically move to flank their leader. "You've spent months trying to make me feel like I don't belong here, like I'm some kind of charity case who should be grateful for your tolerance." Coach Martinez was looking around frantically, clearly recognizing that the situation had escalated beyond his ability to manage through normal classroom authority. Mr. Peterson was moving closer from his position near the doorway, his expression suggesting he was preparing to intervene in whatever was about to happen. "You want to know about my qualifications?" Zara asked, her voice dropping to a level that somehow carried more menace than when she had been shouting. "You want to know what I've earned through hard work and legitimate achievement?" She bounced the basketball once, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet gymnasium like a gunshot. When she caught it, her grip and positioning were different. No longer the uncertain handling of a struggling student, but the controlled precision of someone who understood exactly what they were capable of. "I've been training in traditional Chinese martial arts since I was 11 years old," Zara said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made everyone listening believe every word without question. 5 years under the instruction of my grandmother Chen Wei, who learned her skills in rural China during a time when knowing how to fight wasn't a hobby, it was survival. The revelation sent a wave of murmurs through the gathered students, but Zara wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and years of suppressed truth were pouring out with the force of a breaking dam. "You want to know about level playing fields?" she continued, taking another step toward Brittany that made the blonde girl's confident posture begin to crumble. "I've been holding back every single day since I started at this school. Every insult, every attack, every deliberate attempt to humiliate me. I've absorbed it all because I was taught that true strength means knowing when not to use what you've learned. Rachel, with her athlete's instincts, was the first to recognize that the situation had shifted into genuinely dangerous territory. "Coach," she said, her voice tight with concern, "maybe we should. But you know what I realized today?" Zara interrupted, her attention still focused entirely on Brittany. "Sometimes holding back just enables people like you to keep hurting others. Sometimes patience is just another word for cowardice." She set the basketball down carefully, her movements precise and controlled in ways that suggested every action was deliberate and purposeful. "You want to see what someone from my background is really capable of? You want to know what happens when the charity case stops playing by your rules?" The gymnasium had gone completely silent now, with even students from the far end of the court turning to watch what was clearly building toward some kind of confrontation. Coach Martinez was frantically signaling toward Mr. Peterson, but the assistant principal was still too far away to intervene effectively. "Zara," Coach Martinez said, his voice carrying the kind of urgent authority that teachers used when they sensed a situation spinning completely out of control. "I think we all need to take a step back and—" "No," Zara said, her voice cutting through his attempt at de-escalation with absolute finality. "I'm done stepping back. I'm done making myself smaller so people like her can feel bigger. I'm done pretending to be weak so bullies can feel strong." She looked directly at Brittany, who was now clearly recognizing that she had pushed someone far beyond the breaking point she had intended to reach. "You wanted to know about my qualifications? Here's what 5 years of traditional Chinese martial arts training actually looks like." What happened next would be talked about at Lincoln Heights High School for years to come, passed down through graduating classes like a legend that grew more dramatic with each retelling. But for those who witnessed it firsthand, no embellishment would ever be necessary to capture the shocking reality of what Zara Washington was truly capable of when her carefully maintained facade of vulnerability finally fell away. The quiet girl from the wrong side of town was about to show everyone exactly what it meant to underestimate someone who had been trained by a grandmother who understood that sometimes the greatest kindness was teaching someone how to be dangerous enough to protect themselves and others from predators who mistook gentleness for weakness. The silence that followed Zara's declaration was unlike anything the Lincoln Heights Gymnasium had ever experienced. It wasn't the temporary quiet that comes during a pause in activity, but the profound stillness that occurs when an entire room of people simultaneously realizes they are about to witness something extraordinary. Brittany's face had gone through several rapid transformations as the implications of Zara's words sank in. The confident smirk that had been her trademark expression throughout the harassment campaign had dissolved into something approaching genuine concern. For the first time in their months of interaction, she was looking at Zara not as a victim to be manipulated, but as a potential threat whose capabilities she had fundamentally miscalculated. "You're bluffing," Brittany said, but her voice lacked the authoritative certainty that had characterized all her previous attacks. "You're just trying to scare people because you can't handle being called out for what you really are." The words were delivered with forced bravado, a desperate attempt to reassert the social dominance that had defined her identity for so long. But everyone watching could hear the uncertainty beneath her defiance, the subtle crack in her armor that suggested she was no longer operating from a position of guaranteed safety. Zara's response was to simply smile, not the nervous, apologetic expression that had characterized her interactions at Lincoln Heights, but something that her grandmother would have recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who had been pushed beyond their breaking point and discovered that the space beyond patience contained possibilities that patience itself had never allowed. "I don't bluff," Zara said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet confidence that made every person in the gymnasium lean forward to catch her words. "And I don't make threats. I make promises." The distinction was delivered with such casual certainty that several students took involuntary steps backward, their survival instincts recognizing something in Zara's demeanor that their conscious minds couldn't quite process. This was no longer a bullying situation they were observing. It had transformed into something far more primal and dangerous. Coach Martinez was frantically trying to wave Mr. Peterson closer, while simultaneously positioning himself to intervene if the situation escalated to physical confrontation. But his movements were uncertain, clearly torn between his responsibility to maintain order and his growing recognition that he was witnessing something beyond his training or experience to handle. "Okay, everyone needs to calm down," Coach Martinez said, his voice carrying the kind of forced authority that teachers used when they were trying to regain control of situations that had already moved beyond their influence. "Zara, I think you should step back and take some deep breaths." But Zara's attention remained focused entirely on Brittany, as if the rest of the gymnasium had faded into irrelevance. Years of training had taught her to maintain complete situational awareness during confrontations, but they had also taught her to prioritize genuine threats over peripheral distractions. "You wanted to know about my background," Zara continued, her voice taking on the rhythm and cadence of someone who had spent years reciting forms and principles until they became as natural as breathing. "You wanted to understand what qualifies someone like me to share space with someone like you." She began moving in a slow circle around Brittany, her steps deliberate and measured in ways that suggested she was no longer simply walking, but had shifted into something more fundamental, the controlled movement of a predator assessing its prey. "My grandmother taught me that there are two kinds of strength in this world," Zara said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent gymnasium. "There's the strength that comes from privilege and position, from having power handed to you by circumstances beyond your control. And then there's the strength that comes from surviving things that would break people who've never had to fight for anything." Megan and Rachel had moved closer to their leader, but their positioning was no longer the confident flanking of enforcers supporting their commander. They were moving like people seeking protection, unconsciously looking for ways to put distance between themselves and whatever was building in the space between Zara and Brittany. "You've spent months trying to break me down because you recognized something in me that threatened you," Zara continued, her circular movement bringing her close enough to Brittany that the blonde girl had to fight the urge to step backward. "You saw strength that didn't come from money or status or social position, and it scared you because it was the kind of strength you could never understand or control." The psychological warfare was devastating in its precision, turning Brittany's own tactics against her with surgical accuracy. But where Brittany's attacks had been designed to humiliate and diminish, Zara's words carried the weight of truth that cut deeper than any insult. "That's not," Brittany began, but her voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear that was beginning to overwhelm her practiced confidence. "Not what?" Zara interrupted, stopping her circular movement to face Brittany directly. "Not true. Not the reason you've been so determined to put me in my place. Not the explanation for why you couldn't just leave me alone?" The questions came rapid fire, each one building pressure like a sequence of strikes designed to overwhelm an opponent's defenses. Zara had learned from her grandmother that psychological confrontation often preceded physical engagement, and that victory could sometimes be achieved through mental dominance alone. Mr. Peterson had finally reached their section of the court, his expression showing the kind of professional concern that suggested he was prepared to intervene with whatever authority was necessary to prevent the situation from escalating further. But as he approached, he seemed to sense that he was walking into something more complex than a typical school disciplinary issue. "Ladies," Mr. Peterson said, his voice carrying the kind of administrative authority that was designed to immediately de-escalate student conflicts. "I think we need to move this conversation to my office where we can discuss whatever issues you're having in a more appropriate setting." But Zara's response made it clear that the time for administrative solutions had passed. "There's nothing to discuss," she said, her voice remaining calm and controlled despite the intensity of the moment. "Everything that needed to be said has been said. Now it's time for demonstration." The word demonstration sent a visible chill through the gathered students, its implications immediately clear to everyone watching. This was no longer about verbal confrontation or social manipulation. Zara was announcing her intention to provide a physical display of the capabilities she had been describing. Brittany's survival instincts finally overcame her social conditioning, and she took several rapid steps backward, her movement so sudden that she nearly collided with Megan. "You can't touch me," she said, her voice rising to a pitch that betrayed genuine panic. "If you lay a hand on me, you'll be expelled and probably arrested." The threat was delivered with the desperation of someone who had suddenly realized that the social protections she had always relied upon might not be sufficient to shield her from the consequences of her actions. For the first time in her life, Brittany was facing someone who might not be deterred by the threat of official punishment. Zara's laugh was soft but carried clearly through the silent gymnasium, and its tone made several people shiver involuntarily. "You think I'm going to attack you?" she asked, genuine amusement coloring her voice. "You think this is about me hurting you?" The questions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what was actually taking place. Brittany, operating from her limited experience with conflict, had assumed that Zara's demonstration would involve some form of assault that could be reported and punished through normal channels. "This isn't about hurting you, Brittany," Zara continued, her voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher explaining a complex concept to a struggling student. "This is about showing you what real strength looks like when it's controlled by someone who understands the difference between power and cruelty." She reached down and picked up the basketball she had set aside earlier, her movements so fluid and economical that it seemed to flow like water. When she straightened, her posture had changed completely. No longer the hunched, defensive positioning of someone trying to avoid attention, but the balanced, centered stance of someone who had trained their body to be a precision instrument. "You wanted to see what someone from my background could do," Zara said, holding the basketball with a grip that looked casual but suggested complete control. "You wanted to know if I belonged on the same court as people like you." What happened next would become the stuff of legend at Lincoln Heights High School, talked about in hushed tones and increasingly elaborate retellings for years to come. But for those who witnessed it firsthand, no embellishment would ever capture the shocking display of skill and control that followed. Zara began moving the basketball in patterns that defied easy description. It wasn't traditional basketball handling. It was something far more sophisticated, incorporating elements of hand-eye coordination and spatial awareness that clearly came from training systems most of the watching students had never seen. The ball moved around her body in complex three-dimensional patterns, sometimes appearing to float in midair before being caught and redirected with movements too quick for the eye to fully follow. It was as if she was performing a martial arts form using the basketball as a prop, demonstrating control and precision that belonged in a completely different category from anything her classmates had ever witnessed. "This is what 5 years of traditional training looks like," Zara said, her voice remaining perfectly calm and steady despite the complex physical demonstration she was performing. "This is what happens when someone teaches you that your body is capable of things most people never imagine." The basketball moved through increasingly complex patterns, sometimes spinning on single fingers, sometimes passing behind her back or between her legs in movements that seemed to violate the basic physics of ball handling. Students who had been watching from other parts of the gymnasium were abandoning their own activities to witness what was clearly an unprecedented display of athletic skill. But the most shocking aspect of the demonstration wasn't the technical complexity. It was the casual ease with which Zara was performing movements that would have challenged professional athletes. She was making it look effortless, as if the basketball was simply an extension of her will rather than an external object requiring conscious manipulation. "You spent months trying to convince people that I didn't belong here," Zara continued, the basketball continuing its mesmerizing dance around her body without any apparent break in her concentration. "You wanted everyone to see me as someone who needed your tolerance and charity." The irony was devastating. While Brittany had been working to establish Zara as inadequate and out of place, Zara was demonstrating abilities that made everyone else in the gymnasium look like beginners by comparison. The social hierarchy that Brittany had worked so carefully to maintain was being completely inverted through this display of genuine, undeniable superiority. Coach Martinez stood frozen, his coaching experience providing no framework for understanding what he was witnessing. This wasn't basketball skill in any traditional sense. It was something that transcended sports entirely, moving into the realm of performance art or martial demonstration. Mr. Peterson's expression showed similar confusion, his administrative training having prepared him for many types of student conflicts, but nothing that resembled what was unfolding before him. He was clearly recognizing that any attempt to intervene might actually escalate rather than resolve the situation. Finally, Zara brought the basketball to a stop, catching it with a movement so smooth and controlled that the transition from complex motion to stillness seemed to happen without any intermediate phase. She held the ball casually at her side, her breathing completely normal despite the intricate display she had just performed. "That was me holding back," she said, her voice carrying across the silent gymnasium with perfect clarity. "That was me showing you just a tiny fraction of what I'm actually capable of when I choose to demonstrate rather than hide." The impact of her words was immediate and devastating. Every person watching understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, but more importantly, they understood that it represented only the beginning of what Zara could do if she chose to reveal more of her capabilities. Brittany's face had gone completely pale, her earlier confidence replaced by something approaching terror, as the full implications of her miscalculation became clear. She had spent months attacking someone who had been deliberately restraining abilities that dwarfed anything she or her friends could imagine. The silence that followed Zara's demonstration stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant sounds of other classes continuing their normal activities in far corners of the school. The gymnasium had become its own isolated universe, where the fundamental rules of social interaction had just been rewritten in front of 30 witnesses. Brittany stood frozen in place, her normally perfect posture replaced by the slightly hunched stance of someone who had just realized they were completely outmatched. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and she kept glancing toward the exits as if calculating escape routes from a situation that had spiraled far beyond her ability to control or comprehend. Megan was the first to break, her nervous energy finally overwhelming her ability to maintain the facade of loyalty that had defined her relationship with Brittany. "I think I should go to the nurse," she said, her voice shaky and uncertain. "I'm not feeling very well." The excuse was transparently false, but it provided her with a socially acceptable way to distance herself from what was clearly becoming a losing position. Without waiting for permission from Brittany or Coach Martinez, she grabbed her water bottle and headed toward the gymnasium doors, with the quick, unsteady steps of someone fleeing a disaster. Rachel remained at Brittany's side, but her athletic confidence had been replaced by the kind of wary assessment that competitive athletes used when facing opponents whose capabilities exceeded their own. She was studying Zara with new eyes, trying to reconcile the quiet girl she thought she knew with the person who had just displayed abilities that belonged in an entirely different category of human performance. "That was impossible," Rachel said, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. "What you just did with that basketball, that's not something you learn in gym class or even from professional coaching. Where did you really learn to do that?" The question was delivered without the hostile edge that had characterized all of Rachel's previous interactions with Zara. For the first time, she was speaking to Zara as an equal, recognizing that she was in the presence of someone whose training and abilities commanded genuine respect. Zara set the basketball down carefully, her movement still carrying the controlled precision that had characterized her demonstration. "I told you where I learned it," she replied, her voice calm but carrying an undertone that suggested she was not interested in repeating herself. "My grandmother spent 5 years teaching me things that most people in this country never learn." Coach Martinez was still standing in stunned silence, his coaching experience providing no framework for understanding what he had just witnessed. He had seen talented athletes, even prodigiously gifted ones, but what Zara had demonstrated transcended normal categories of athletic ability entirely. "Zara," he said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and concern, "I think we need to have a serious conversation about your background and training. What you just showed us raises some questions about your enrollment in regular physical education classes." The implication was clear. Zara's abilities were so far beyond those of her classmates that her participation in normal gym activities might not be appropriate or fair. But the suggestion also carried undertones that made her tense with familiar defensive instincts. "Are you saying I don't belong here either?" Zara asked, her voice carrying a warning edge that made several nearby students take involuntary steps backward. "Are you suggesting that being too skilled is somehow a problem that needs to be solved?" Mr. Peterson, who had been observing the entire interaction with the kind of careful attention that school administrators used when trying to assess complex disciplinary situations, stepped forward with the diplomatic tone that came from years of managing volatile teenage conflicts. "I don't think anyone is questioning your right to be here, Zara," he said carefully, "but I think we all need to understand what just happened and how we move forward from this point." His words were measured and professional, but they carried the unmistakable weight of authority. Whatever happened next would be shaped by administrative decisions that could affect Zara's future at Lincoln Heights in ways that went far beyond the immediate confrontation with Brittany. Around them, other students were beginning to find their voices, whispering among themselves as they processed what they had witnessed. The conversations were hushed but intense, carrying the kind of energy that suggested word of this incident would spread throughout the school within hours. "Did you see how she moved?" one student whispered to another. "That wasn't normal human coordination, that was like watching someone who had superpowers or something." "I heard her say something about Chinese martial arts," another voice added. "My older brother does karate, but I've never seen him do anything even close to that level." "Brittany looked like she was about to pass out," came a third observation. "I don't think I've ever seen her scared before. She always acts like she's untouchable." The social dynamics of the gymnasium were shifting in real time, as students recalibrated their understanding of both Zara and Brittany based on what they had just witnessed. Hierarchies that had seemed fixed and permanent were suddenly revealed as artificial constructs that could be dismantled in a matter of minutes. Kevin Chen, who had tried to intervene earlier during the basketball drills, approached Zara with the kind of respectful caution that suggested he was recognizing her in an entirely new light. "That was incredible," he said, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "I've been playing basketball since I was 6 years old, and I've never seen anyone handle a ball like that." His comment drew nods from several other students who were beginning to overcome their initial shock enough to express their reactions. The atmosphere was shifting from stunned silence to amazed appreciation as the implications of Zara's demonstration began to sink in. But not everyone was adjusting to the new reality with equal grace. Brittany had remained largely silent since her failed attempt to dismiss Zara's capabilities as bluffing, but her expression suggested she was struggling to process a fundamental challenge to her worldview. "This isn't over," Brittany said suddenly, her voice carrying a desperate edge that suggested she was grasping for some way to reassert control over a situation that had moved completely beyond her influence. "Just because you can do some fancy tricks with a basketball doesn't change what you are or where you come from." The words were delivered with the kind of forced defiance that people used when they knew they were losing but couldn't bring themselves to admit defeat. But they also carried undertones of escalation that suggested Brittany was not prepared to simply accept the collapse of her social dominance. Zara's response was immediate and devastating in its simplicity. "You're right," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that made everyone listening understand that this was not a concession but a statement of power. "This doesn't change what I am. I'm still the girl from the wrong side of town whose family works multiple jobs to make ends meet." She paused, letting the acknowledgement settle before delivering the conclusion that would reshape how everyone present understood the relationship between social status and genuine capability. "But what it does change is your ability to use those facts as weapons against me," Zara continued. "Because now everyone here knows that underneath all your privilege and designer clothes and social connections, you're just another scared little girl who can't handle the existence of someone who didn't need any of those things to become extraordinary." The psychological devastation was complete and surgical. Zara had taken every element that Brittany had used to establish superiority and revealed them as marks of weakness rather than strength. The inversion was so complete that several students actually gasped audibly at the brutal efficiency of the attack. Brittany's face cycled through several expressions as she processed the full implications of Zara's words. Rage, humiliation, and fear competed for dominance as she struggled to find some response that could salvage even a fraction of her former authority. "You think you've won something here?" Brittany asked, her voice shaking slightly with suppressed emotion. "You think showing off makes you better than me?" But the question revealed how completely she had misunderstood what had actually taken place. This hadn't been about competition or superiority. It had been about consequences and the revelation of truths that had been hidden beneath carefully maintained facades. "I don't think I'm better than you," Zara replied, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been a pity. "I know that I'm different from you. I know that I've had to earn everything I have while you've had everything handed to you. And I know that when people like me finally decide to stop hiding what we're capable of, people like you discover that all your advantages were just illusions." The words carried the weight of generational wisdom passed down from her grandmother, insights about power and survival that came from experiences far removed from the sheltered environment of suburban high schools. But they also carried the immediate reality of a teenager who had just discovered her own strength after months of deliberate self-suppression. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the administrative reality that would ultimately determine how this incident was handled officially. "I think we need to move this conversation to a more private setting," he said, his tone suggesting that the public nature of the confrontation was creating complications beyond the immediate conflict between students. "Why?" Zara asked, turning her attention to the assistant principal with the same direct intensity she had focused on Brittany. "Because what happened here might encourage other students to stand up for themselves. Because it might give people ideas about fighting back against bullies." The questions were delivered with the kind of clarity that made everyone present understand that Zara was operating from a completely different framework than the administrative systems designed to manage student conflicts. She wasn't thinking about disciplinary procedures or maintaining order. She was thinking about justice and consequences and the right of people to defend themselves against systematic harassment. "That's not what I meant," Mr. Peterson replied. But his voice carried the uncertainty of someone who was beginning to realize that normal administrative responses might not be adequate for addressing what had actually taken place. Coach Martinez, who had been listening to the exchanges with growing confusion, finally found his voice again. "Zara, regardless of what led up to this situation, I need to understand your training background. What you demonstrated goes beyond anything I've seen in 30 years of coaching. If you have abilities at this level, there are programs and opportunities you should be aware of." The comment represented a fundamental shift in how authority figures were responding to Zara. Instead of treating her as a problem to be managed, Coach Martinez was beginning to recognize her as a resource that might need different types of support and development. But Zara's response revealed that she was thinking about implications far beyond athletic opportunities. "My training wasn't about sports or competitions," she said, her voice carrying the weight of lessons learned in very different contexts. "It was about survival and protection, and knowing how to handle people who mistake kindness for weakness." She looked around the gymnasium, taking in the faces of students who were still processing what they had witnessed. Today was about showing everyone here that the quiet kids, the scholarship students, the people you think you can push around, we're not as helpless as you assume. Some of us have been taught things that your money and status can't buy. The message was delivered not just to Brittany and her diminished circle, but to every student who had witnessed the confrontation. It was a declaration that would reshape social dynamics throughout Lincoln Heights High School as word of the incident spread beyond the gymnasium walls. The immediate aftermath was unfolding exactly as Zara had intended, not as a victory over a single bully, but as a demonstration that would fundamentally alter how she and students like her were perceived and treated by their classmates. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and would prove to have consequences that extended far beyond anything anyone present could have anticipated. The ripple effects of the confrontation were already beginning to manifest in subtle but significant ways. Students who had never spoken to Zara before were approaching her with expressions of curiosity and respect, their body language completely different from the dismissive glances she had grown accustomed to receiving. "Excuse me," said Maria Santos, a quiet sophomore who had been one of Brittany's occasional targets. "Could I talk to you for a minute?" Maria's approach was hesitant but determined, the movement of someone who had been gathering courage for something important. She had been standing near the back of the crowd during the demonstration, but her positioning suggested she had been paying close attention to every detail of what had unfolded. "I've been dealing with some people who think they can push me around," Maria continued, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying an intensity that suggested she was fighting through significant fear to have this conversation. "Could you maybe teach me some of what your grandmother taught you?" The request was delivered with the kind of desperate hope that suggested Maria had been enduring her own campaign of harassment and saw in Zara's revelation a possible path toward defending herself. It was exactly the kind of consequence that would make this incident significant, beyond the immediate confrontation with Brittany. Before Zara could respond, several other students had moved closer, their expressions suggesting they were interested in overhearing whatever advice might be offered. The gymnasium was transforming into an impromptu gathering around someone who had just been revealed as possessing knowledge and capabilities that others desperately needed. "That's enough," Mr. Peterson said, his administrative instincts finally overriding his fascination with what he had witnessed. "Everyone needs to return to their regular activities. Zara, Brittany, and Rachel, I need you to come with me to discuss what happened here." But even as he issued the directive, his tone carried less authority than it would have before Zara's demonstration. The revelation of her capabilities had shifted the power dynamics in ways that extended beyond student relationships to include interactions with faculty and administration. "Actually," Zara said, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had characterized her confrontation with Brittany, "I think Maria's question deserves an answer before we go anywhere." The direct challenge to Mr. Peterson's directive sent a visible shock through the gathered students. No one at Lincoln Heights challenged administrative authority openly, especially not students who were already in potential disciplinary trouble. But Zara's posture and tone suggested she was operating from a completely different understanding of power relationships than her classmates. Her grandmother's training had included lessons about when to submit to authority and when to assert personal agency, and she was applying those principles in real time. "Maria," Zara said, turning her attention back to the sophomore with the kind of focused intensity that made everyone else fade into background noise. "The first thing my grandmother taught me was that real strength doesn't come from fighting. It comes from knowing that you can fight if you have to." The distinction was delivered with the weight of hard-earned wisdom, carrying implications that went far beyond physical confrontation. Several students were leaning forward to catch every word, recognizing that they were receiving instruction in something far more valuable than typical teenage advice. Most bullies are looking for easy targets, Zara continued, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium despite its conversational volume. They want people who won't fight back, who will absorb abuse without consequences. When you change that dynamic, when you make it clear that harassing you will be more trouble than it's worth, most of them will move on to easier prey. The lesson was being delivered not just to Maria, but to every student within hearing range, many of whom had their own experiences with systematic harassment and intimidation. Zara was providing practical wisdom that could reshape how dozens of students approached their own survival strategies. But what if they don't back down? Asked Danny Rodriguez, a freshman who had been quietly enduring his own campaign of abuse from older students. What if standing up to them just makes things worse? The question revealed the core fear that kept most victims trapped in cycles of harassment, the reasonable concern that resistance would escalate rather than resolve conflicts. It was exactly the kind of complex issue that required nuanced understanding rather than simple advice. That's when you need to understand the difference between showing strength and using it, Zara replied, her voice carrying the patience of someone who had spent years learning these distinctions through direct experience. Sometimes a demonstration like what you saw today is enough. Sometimes you need to be more specific in your responses. The word specific was delivered with enough subtle emphasis to suggest that Zara's capabilities extended far beyond basketball demonstrations, while remaining vague enough to avoid explicit threats that could create additional disciplinary complications. Rachel, who had been listening to the impromptu lesson with growing unease, finally found her voice again. "You're talking about fighting," she said, her competitive nature making her more direct than her companions. "You're encouraging people to get into physical confrontations." But Zara's response revealed the sophisticated understanding that separated her training from simple aggression. "I'm talking about understanding that people like Brittany count on your unwillingness to defend yourself," she said, her gaze moving to include the blonde girl who had remained largely silent since her failed attempt to dismiss the demonstration. They build their entire social strategy around the assumption that their targets will absorb abuse rather than create consequences for harassment. When that assumption proves incorrect, their entire approach falls apart. The analysis was devastating in its accuracy, laying bare the psychological foundations that enabled systematic bullying, while providing a roadmap for dismantling those foundations. Several students were nodding in recognition, clearly connecting Zara's words to their own experiences with social manipulation. Brittany, who had been growing increasingly agitated during the extended lesson, finally exploded with the kind of desperate anger that came from watching her former victim become a teacher and inspiration to others. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising to a level that drew attention from students throughout the gymnasium. "You can't just encourage people to start fights and call it self-defense. There are rules about this kind of thing." But her outburst only served to reinforce the points Zara had been making about the psychology of bullies. Faced with the collapse of her ability to intimidate and control, Brittany was appealing to authority structures and rule systems that she had never needed to rely on when she held social dominance. "You're right," Zara said, her calm response providing a stark contrast to Brittany's emotional escalation. "There are rules. And for months, you've been violating those rules through systematic harassment, psychological abuse, and deliberate attempts to humiliate and isolate me." She paused, letting the accusation settle before delivering the conclusion that would reshape how everyone present understood the moral dynamics of their situation. "The difference is that when you broke the rules, you used them to hurt someone who couldn't fight back effectively. When I defend myself, I'm showing people that those same rules can protect targets if they're willing to use them strategically." The distinction was philosophically sophisticated and practically devastating, revealing Zara as someone who understood conflict at levels that went far beyond the simple aggression that characterized most teenage confrontations. Coach Martinez, who had been listening to the extended discussion with growing amazement, finally stepped forward with the kind of professional curiosity that suggested he was beginning to see educational opportunities in what was unfolding. "Zara," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and professional interest, "have you ever considered teaching what you know? Because what you're describing sounds like something that could benefit a lot of students who are dealing with similar situations." The suggestion was revolutionary in the context of Lincoln Heights High School, where conflicts were typically addressed through punitive measures rather than educational interventions. But Coach Martinez was recognizing that Zara possessed knowledge and capabilities that could transform how the school approached bullying prevention. However, his suggestion also carried implications that made Mr. Peterson visibly uncomfortable. The idea of officially sanctioning instruction in self-defense techniques raised liability concerns and policy questions that extended far beyond the immediate disciplinary situation. "I think we really do need to move this conversation to a more private setting," Mr. Peterson said, his tone carrying more urgency than before. "The issues we're discussing have implications that need to be addressed through proper administrative channels." But the damage to traditional administrative authority had already been done. Zara's demonstration and subsequent teaching had revealed alternative approaches to conflict resolution that operated outside normal institutional frameworks, and students were clearly recognizing the value of those alternatives. The gymnasium had become a site of transformation that would continue to influence Lincoln Heights High School long after the immediate participants had moved on to other activities. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in the gymnasium, and Lincoln Heights High School had become a fundamentally different place. The transformation wasn't immediately obvious to casual observers. Classes still met on schedule, hallways still filled with the familiar chaos of teenage social navigation, and the basic rhythms of academic life continued unchanged. But beneath the surface, something profound had shifted in the school's social ecosystem. Zara walked through the main entrance on a crisp October morning, her posture completely different from the hunched, defensive positioning that had characterized her first months at Lincoln Heights. She moved with the confident grace of someone who had discovered her own power and learned to carry it responsibly. Students who passed her in the hallways offered respectful nods or genuine smiles, a stark contrast to the dismissive glances or cruel whispers that had once followed her everywhere. The administrative fallout from the gymnasium confrontation had been complex and ultimately transformative for the entire school district. Mr. Peterson had initially attempted to handle the incident through traditional disciplinary channels, scheduling meetings with parents and preparing suspension paperwork that would have treated Zara's demonstration as a threat to school safety. But the video footage captured by multiple students had told a different story. When the recordings spread through social media and reached parents throughout the community, the narrative that emerged was not of a dangerous student threatening others, but of a victim finally standing up to systematic harassment in a way that revealed extraordinary capabilities and remarkable restraint. The school board meeting that followed had been unlike anything in the district's history. Parents packed the auditorium to capacity, but instead of demanding punishment for Zara, most had come to question why the systematic bullying she had endured had been allowed to continue unchecked for months. The administration found itself defending not Zara's actions, but their own failure to address the harassment that had led to the confrontation. Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist who specialized in school conflict resolution, had been brought in as a consultant to review the incident and provide recommendations for moving forward. Her report had become a watershed moment for how Lincoln Heights approached student conflicts and social dynamics. "What we witnessed in that gymnasium," Dr. Chen had explained to the school board, "was not an act of aggression or violence, but a masterclass in controlled response to provocation." Miss Washington demonstrated remarkable restraint and sophistication in her handling of a situation that would have escalated to physical violence if managed by most teenagers. Her analysis had shifted the entire conversation from punishment to recognition, from disciplinary action to educational opportunity. Instead of suspensions and sanctions, the outcome had been the implementation of new programs designed to address bullying more effectively while recognizing and supporting students with exceptional capabilities. The most significant change had been the establishment of the Peer Advocacy Program, with Zara serving as its first student coordinator. The program paired students who had experienced bullying with those who had developed effective coping strategies, creating a support network that operated alongside traditional administrative responses. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, Zara met with small groups of students in the old drama classroom that had been converted into a safe space for these discussions. The sessions weren't formal therapy or martial arts instruction, but something more valuable, practical wisdom sharing between young people who understood the complexities of navigating hostile social environments. "The most important thing to understand," Zara was explaining to a group of 6 students during one of these sessions, "is that bullies are looking for specific reactions. They want fear, submission, or angry outbursts that they can use to justify escalating their harassment. Maria Santos, who had become one of Zara's most dedicated participants, raised her hand with the kind of confidence that would have been impossible for her just weeks earlier. But what if they don't stop even when you don't give them the reaction they want? What if they just keep pushing? The question came from hard experience. Maria had been implementing the strategies discussed in previous sessions, and while her situation had improved dramatically, she had encountered some resistance from bullies who weren't accustomed to their targets displaying unexpected resilience. "That's when you need to understand escalation theory," Zara replied, her voice carrying the patient authority of someone who had mastered these concepts through both instruction and practical application. "Most harassment follows predictable patterns. When bullies don't get their expected response at one level, they typically try to increase pressure until they find your breaking point." She moved to the whiteboard and began drawing a simple diagram that illustrated the concept she was describing. The key is to recognize these escalation attempts for what they are, signs of frustration and desperation rather than genuine power. When you understand that their increased aggression actually means they're losing control of the situation, it becomes easier to respond strategically rather than emotionally. Danny Rodriguez, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the session, looked up with the kind of clarity that suggested an important concept was clicking into place. "So when they get more aggressive, it's actually proof that what we're doing is working?" "Exactly," Zara confirmed, her grandmother's wisdom flowing through her as naturally as breathing. "My grandmother used to say that a cornered animal becomes most dangerous right before it realizes it needs to retreat. Bullies follow the same pattern." The insight was transforming how these students understood their own experiences with harassment. Instead of interpreting escalation as evidence that resistance was futile, they were learning to recognize it as confirmation that their new strategies were effective. But the most remarkable transformation hadn't occurred in the structured environment of the peer advocacy program. It had happened in the relationship between Zara and the person who had tormented her for months, Brittany Caldwell. The change had begun 2 weeks after the gymnasium incident, when Brittany had approached Zara after school with the kind of hesitant uncertainty that suggested she was operating completely outside her comfort zone. The confident predator who had orchestrated months of systematic harassment had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely confused about how to navigate social interactions without cruelty as her primary tool. "I need to talk to you," Brittany had said, her voice lacking any trace of the authoritative tone that had once made other students step aside automatically. "And I need to ask you something that's going to sound really stupid." The conversation that followed had revealed depths to Brittany's character that no one at Lincoln Heights had ever suspected existed. Stripped of her ability to maintain dominance through intimidation, she had been forced to confront aspects of herself that she had spent years avoiding through the distraction of hurting others. "I don't know how to be around people without making them feel bad," Brittany had admitted, her voice carrying the kind of vulnerable honesty that suggested she was sharing something she had never acknowledged even to herself. "It's like I only know how to feel good about myself by making other people feel worse." The revelation had been both shocking and heartbreaking, offering insight into the psychological mechanisms that drove systematic bullying, while suggesting the possibility of genuine change if those mechanisms could be understood and redirected. Zara's response had drawn on wisdom that went far beyond her 16 years, channeling lessons from her grandmother about the difference between justice and revenge, between strength and cruelty. "The first step is recognizing that hurting others never actually makes you feel better," she had said. "It just creates a temporary distraction from whatever's really bothering you." What had followed was an unlikely mentorship that challenged everything both girls thought they understood about power, relationships, and personal growth. Brittany had begun attending the peer advocacy sessions, not as a victim seeking support, but as someone trying to understand the psychological damage she had inflicted and learn alternative ways of interacting with others. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. Brittany's first attempts at normal social interaction had been clumsy and often tone-deaf, revealing just how dependent she had become on intimidation and manipulation as social tools. But she had persisted with the kind of determination that suggested genuine commitment to change. "I spent years convincing myself that people like you were beneath me," Brittany had said during one particularly difficult conversation. "But the truth is, I was terrified that people like you were actually better than me in ways I could never achieve, so I tried to tear you down instead of building myself up." The admission had been delivered with the kind of raw honesty that suggested months of difficult self-examination and genuine remorse. It wasn't the performative apology that teenagers often offered when facing consequences, but something far more valuable: actual understanding of the harm she had caused and the psychological roots of her behavior. But perhaps the most significant change at Lincoln Heights had been institutional rather than individual. The school's approach to conflict resolution had been completely overhauled, with new policies that emphasized education and support over punishment and exclusion. Principal Williams had worked with Dr. Chen to implement a restorative justice program that brought together bullies and their victims in structured conversations designed to address harm while promoting understanding and growth. The program had become a model for other schools in the district, with educators visiting from neighboring communities to observe the innovative approaches being developed. Coach Martinez had expanded his role beyond athletics to become the school's first student capability coordinator, working to identify students with exceptional abilities or unusual backgrounds who might benefit from specialized support or alternative educational opportunities. His recognition of Zara's unique talents had led to similar discoveries about other students whose capabilities had been overlooked or undervalued. The gymnasium where the confrontation had taken place had been transformed as well, with new programs that went far beyond traditional physical education. Applied conflict resolution had become an elective course that combined elements of martial arts philosophy, psychological education, and practical communication skills. Zara served as a student instructor for the course, working alongside Coach Martinez to teach other teenagers the principles her grandmother had passed down through generations of survival wisdom. But the instruction went far beyond physical techniques to encompass the mental and emotional disciplines that made physical skills both effective and responsible. True martial arts, Zara explained to a class of eager students, isn't about learning how to hurt people. It's about developing the confidence and capability to protect yourself and others without needing to prove anything to anyone. The distinction was crucial to everything the program sought to accomplish. Students learned physical techniques, but they also learned the philosophical frameworks that made those techniques tools of protection rather than aggression. As Zara walked through the hallways of Lincoln Heights on that October morning, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since the day she had finally stopped hiding her capabilities. The quiet girl who had spent months trying to remain invisible had become a leader and teacher whose influence extended far beyond her immediate circle of friends. But the most important change hadn't been in how others saw her. It had been in how she saw herself. The discovery that strength could be used to protect rather than dominate, that power could be shared rather than hoarded, and that standing up for herself could inspire others to find their own courage had transformed her understanding of what it meant to be truly powerful. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory as she approached her first class of the day. Little treasure, the greatest victory is not in defeating your enemies, but in showing them how to become your allies. The wisdom had proven prophetic in ways that even Chen Wei might not have anticipated. The confrontation in the gymnasium hadn't just ended Zara's victimization. It had begun a transformation that would influence Lincoln Heights High School for years to come, creating a legacy of strength, wisdom, and compassion that would protect countless students who came after her. The girl who had once hidden her light to avoid drawing attention had learned to shine in ways that illuminated the path for others to find their own power and purpose. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.